What if the most disturbing idea in modern physics is not that the universe will eventually end, but that your conscious experience cannot? Not in a spiritual sense, in a mathematical one. There is a serious interpretation of quantum mechanics, defended by Nobel laureates and tenured cosmologists, in which the version of you reading these words can never, from the inside, experience your own death. Tonight, we are going to walk through it, the equation that refuses to collapse, the corridor of catastrophic survival. So get comfortable, settle in, and let me show you why the math has been quietly terrifying physicists for almost 70 years now. Part 1. The thought experiment that should not have survived peer review. Imagine a room, a small, plain room with one chair, and on a table in front of the chair, a mechanical device. The device is wired to a detector. The detector contains a single subatomic particle, and the detector is built to measure one specific property of that particle, a property called spin. If the measurement comes back as one value, the device triggers a lethal outcome. If the measurement comes back as the other value, the device clicks and does nothing. A volunteer sits in the chair, the detector cycles, and then it cycles again. The first cycle, there is what feels like a 50% chance the volunteer doesn't survive. The second cycle, the same. By the 10th cycle, their statistical chance of being alive is roughly 1 in 1,000. By the 100th cycle, their statistical chance of being alive is something like 1 in 10 to the power of 30. That is a number with 30 zeros after it. There are not enough seconds in the age of the universe for that improbability to come up by chance. Anyone running this experiment with a normal coin would be gone long before they got to round 20. And yet, according to one of the most cited interpretations of quantum mechanics, the volunteer cannot lose. From their own point of view, sitting in that chair, they will always find themselves alive on the next cycle, not because they got lucky, because there is no version of them who didn't. The interpretation in question is called the many worlds interpretation. It was first written down at Princeton University in 1957 by a young graduate student named Hugh Everett III, and it was reformulated into this disturbing thought experiment in 1998 by a tenured cosmologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology named Max Tegmark. Tegmark called it the quantum survival experiment, and what makes it so unsettling is that it is not designed to prove the many worlds interpretation. It is simply designed to show what the many worlds interpretation says, when you take it literally, about a conscious being who has bound their fate to a single quantum event. Let me explain what spin even means here, because the word is misleading. When physicists say a particle has spin, they do not mean it is rotating in the way a basketball rotates. They mean it has a quantum mechanical property that, when measured along any chosen direction, comes out as one of exactly two values, up or down, heads or tails. There is no in-between, and there is no smooth gradient. The two values are equally likely in the absence of any prior bias, and quantum mechanics is perfectly indifferent about which one comes back. In the standard interpretation taught in undergraduate physics, called the Copenhagen interpretation, the act of measurement causes the particle's quantum state to collapse into one of the two values. One outcome happens, the other vanishes. Probability becomes destiny. Under Copenhagen, if the volunteer sits in that chair and the device cycles 100 times, they have effectively a 1 in 10 to the 30 chance of being alive at the end. Statistically, they should be gone. Anyone running that experiment, under Copenhagen, should not survive it. Nothing about the universe protects them. Hugh Everett did not believe in collapse. He looked at the math, specifically at the equation that governs quantum behavior, an equation called the Schrödinger equation, and he noticed something nobody before him had taken seriously. The Schrödinger equation does not describe collapse. The Schrödinger equation describes a smooth, continuous, deterministic evolution of a quantum state. The collapse was an addition, a rule applied by hand, only at the moment a measurement happened. Everett asked a simple question. What if we just remove that extra rule? What if the equation kept running, all the way through the measurement, all the way through the device, all the way through the observer? What falls out of that question is a picture of reality that human language struggles to hold. In Everett's reading, the wave function never collapses. Every quantum outcome happens. When the particle's spin is measured, the universe does not pick one value, it branches. In one branch, the spin is up, and the volunteer's life ends. In the other branch, the spin is down, and the volunteer is still there. Both branches are equally real. Both contain a complete universe. And the two branches no longer interact with each other in any way you could detect, because they have decohered, which is a technical word for a process we will return to. But the important point is this: both branches exist. Now here is the strange step. The volunteer's consciousness, whatever it is, by definition can only have a first-person point of view in branches where it continues to exist. In the branch where the volunteer's life has ended, there is no first person there to report from. There is just a body, and then nothing. So when we ask, from the inside, what the volunteer experiences after the cycle, the answer is not a probability. The answer is that they find themselves alive. Always. Because the version of them who didn't find themselves alive cannot answer the question. They are not there to be asked. Now scale this up. Replace the gun with cars, with cancer cells, with the random thermal jiggle of a single sodium ion at a critical moment inside the cardiac muscle of your chest. Every single thing that has ever almost killed you under this reading is a branch where it did. And under this reading, you are the version of yourself who happened to be on the side where it didn't. Not because you were lucky, because you were the one who could still answer the question. I want you to sit with that thought for a moment, because if you are like most people the first time you encounter this argument, the natural reaction is to look for a flaw. There must be a hole in it. There must be a reason this cannot be how the universe works. And that is a reasonable instinct. Physicists themselves have been looking for the hole for almost 70 years now. The hole, if it exists, has not turned up. Every objection that has been raised, when examined carefully, has turned out to soften the conclusion rather than dissolve it. And every softening, when you look at it closely, leaves you somewhere stranger than you started. This is what made physicists hesitate when they first saw it written down. It was not that the math was sloppy, the math was elegant. It was that the math, taken seriously, applied to a conscious observer, produced an answer that nobody wanted to be true. You are not supposed to be afraid of dying under this interpretation. You are supposed to be afraid of what happens when dying stops working. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to walk slowly through this idea. We are going to look at the man who wrote it down, and at what believing it cost him. We are going to look at the equation that refuses to give us a way out. We are going to look at the strange and disturbing argument that a Nobel laureate in physics has been making for 30 years, that consciousness itself might be quantum, and at what that would mean for the question of whether your inside view can ever really end. We are going to look at a recent philosophy paper from 2025 that named the worst version of this idea, something called the corridor of catastrophic survival. We are going to look at the old age problem, and at Boltzmann brains, and at why the cultural intuition we have about the Mandela effect might be folk physics in disguise. And at the end, we are going to sit calmly with what is left when all of it is on the table, because nothing about this video is going to scare you. The whole point of this channel is that the universe is far stranger than intuition suggests, and the slow accumulation of what is actually known is more interesting than any horror story. We are going to take this carefully. But before we get to Tegmark and his device, we have to talk about the man Tegmark was finishing. A man who walked into Princeton in the 1950s as an unknown graduate student, walked out a few years later with a thesis nobody wanted to publish, and may have spent the rest of his life quietly convinced that what he had written was true. So, let me tell you about Hugh Everett. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number. Part 2. The man who wrote it and could not take it back. Hugh Everett III arrived at Princeton in 1953. He was 22 years old, a chemistry undergraduate from Washington, D.C., with a quick mind and a chain-smoking habit and a love of formal logic. He had been admitted to the graduate program in mathematical physics, which at that time was one of the most competitive programs in the world. His thesis advisor was a man named John Archibald Wheeler. Wheeler would later become famous for coining the term black hole and for mentoring Richard Feynman and for advancing some of the most original speculations in 20th century physics. In 1953, Wheeler was already known as a physicist who was unafraid of strange ideas. So when his new graduate student walked into his office and said he wanted to fix the foundations of quantum mechanics, Wheeler listened. The problem Everett wanted to fix was this. By the mid-1950s, quantum mechanics had been the working theory of subatomic physics for almost 30 years. It made spectacularly precise predictions. It powered transistors and lasers and the entire emerging field of solid-state physics. But it had a philosophical problem so embarrassing that the founders had built an entire interpretation around hiding it. The problem was the measurement problem. The Schrödinger equation, which is the central equation of quantum mechanics, describes the smooth, deterministic, continuous evolution of a quantum state. It is one of the most successful equations in the history of science. But the Copenhagen interpretation, which dominated quantum physics in the 1950s, said that at some moment during a measurement, the equation simply stopped applying. The wave function collapsed. One outcome was chosen, the others vanished, and nothing in the equation itself described how, or when, or why. This bothered Everett. He could see no principle, no clean criterion that distinguished a measurement from any other physical interaction. A measurement, in the end, was just a particle interacting with a larger system, and a larger system was just a lot of particles. If the equation applied to one particle, why not to two? If two, why not to 10,000? If 10,000, why not to the laboratory? And if the laboratory, then why not to the physicist standing in the laboratory? Everett's answer was to remove the special rule entirely. Take the Schrödinger equation seriously. Apply it everywhere. Apply it to the particle, the detector, the laboratory, the physicist, the building, the city, the planet. Let it run. What falls out is a picture of quantum mechanics in which the wave function never collapses. When the particle is measured, the particle plus the detector evolve together into a superposition of two outcomes. The detector reads up and the detector reads down, both at once in different branches. When the physicist looks at the detector, the physicist plus the detector evolve together into a superposition of two outcomes. There is a version of the physicist who saw up and a version of the physicist who saw down. Both versions are real. Both versions are deterministic continuations of the same underlying equation. The branches no longer interact because the system has become too large and too entangled with its environment for any practical recombination. But they exist, together, side by side, forever. Everett wrote this up as his doctoral thesis. He defended it in 1957, the year his advisor, John Wheeler, took him to Copenhagen to present the idea in person to Niels Bohr. Bohr was the elder statesman of the Copenhagen interpretation, the man whose name was on the orthodoxy Everett was trying to dismantle. He was in his 70s, and he was not interested in a young man's proposal that the universe was constantly branching into infinite copies of itself. The meeting was, by all accounts, a polite disaster. Bohr was unmoved. The physicists around Bohr were skeptical at best, dismissive at worst. Everett returned to Princeton, having presented one of the most original ideas in the history of his field, and having been told, essentially, that it was nonsense. Everett did not stay in physics. Within months of his thesis defense, he left academia. He took a job at the Pentagon, doing classified work in operations research, applying game theory and probability to questions of nuclear strategy. He became one of the architects of the early American nuclear posture, calculating, with the same mathematical rigor he had once applied to wave functions, how many cities would burn under various scenarios. He started a defense contracting firm. He made a comfortable living. He drank, by the standards of the era and the industry, heroically. He smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day. He almost never spoke about his thesis in public. But he did speak about it in private. Friends, family, the small circle of physicists who would occasionally visit, all later recalled the same thing. Everett believed his interpretation was correct. And more than that, he believed that the personal consequence of that interpretation was true. He believed his consciousness was, in some meaningful sense, immortal. Whatever branch he was in, there was always another branch where he survived. He told people this casually, not as a religious conviction, not as a hope, as a deduction, as the obvious conclusion of taking the math seriously. He was reportedly told by a colleague that if he genuinely believed this, he should not be terrified of driving without his seatbelt. He laughed and said he was not. In July of 1982, Everett died of a sudden cardiac arrest. He was 51 years old. The years of drinking and smoking caught up with him in the way they catch up with almost everyone who lives that way. His funeral was small. His instructions, written long in advance, were that his ashes were to be thrown out with the household trash. His widow, Nancy, honoured the instructions. The ashes were thrown out. In 1996, Everett's daughter Liz passed away. She had been struggling with mental illness for years. The note she left behind said that she was going to a parallel universe to be with her father. Read those words again. A parallel universe. To be with her father. This was not a metaphor. This was a young woman who had grown up in the household of the man who wrote down the many worlds interpretation, who had heard her father, for as long as she could remember, talk about other branches of reality, as if they were as real as the kitchen table. And in her grief, she chose to speak the same language. She believed, or she hoped, or she desperately needed it to be true, that the conclusion her father had been speaking quietly for 30 years was right. That somewhere, in some branch, he was alive, and she could find her way to him there. There is no way to read this story and walk away from it the way you might walk away from a normal piece of physics history. This is not a story about an idea. This is a story about a family. Hugh Everett's son, Mark Oliver Everett, did not follow his father into physics. He became a musician. He fronted the band Eels, the one with the song Novocaine for the Soul, and the album Electro-Shock Blues. In 2007, Mark made a documentary for the BBC called Parallel Worlds, Parallel Lives, in which he travelled to Princeton, met the physicists who had carried his father's idea forward, and tried, with great honesty and visible discomfort, to understand what his father had believed and what it had cost the family. It is one of the most moving documents in the popular history of physics, and very few people have seen it. This is why we are starting with Everett. Because the rest of this video is going to be about an idea, and ideas in physics are very easy to talk about, as if they are just diagrams on a chalkboard. The many worlds interpretation is not a chalkboard idea. It is an idea that a man took seriously enough to base his life around, and an idea that his daughter took seriously enough to base her death around. Whatever you decide about the math by the end of this video, please remember that the math has already touched real people. And the math itself, the equation Everett built his whole argument around, is not going away. In the next part, we are going to look at why. Because something strange has happened in physics in the 70 years since Everett left academia, the interpretation Niels Bohr dismissed as nonsense has not faded into the footnotes. It has, very slowly, become the position that is hardest to dismiss. So let me show you what the Schrödinger equation actually does when you do not give it a way out. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number, part 3. The equation that refuses to collapse. The Schrödinger equation is named after Erwin Schrödinger, who wrote it down in 1926. It is a partial differential equation, which is a particular kind of mathematical machinery for describing how something changes over time. What it describes is the way a quantum state evolves from one moment to the next. If you know the quantum state of a particle right now, the Schrödinger equation tells you, with perfect determinism, what that state will be 1 second from now or 1 billion years from now. There is nothing probabilistic about the equation itself. It is, in fact, one of the smoothest, most well-behaved, most deterministic equations in all of physics. Everything you might find unsettling about quantum mechanics, all the probability and uncertainty and randomness, does not live in the equation. It lives in the rule that was bolted on around the equation, the rule about what happens when somebody looks. Let me put that more carefully. The Schrödinger equation says that a quantum state evolves as a wave function, a kind of mathematical cloud of probabilities. A particle can be in a superposition, meaning the cloud has weight in multiple places at once, or weight on multiple values at once. As long as the system is left alone, the equation just keeps the cloud evolving smoothly and deterministically forever. The cloud spreads, it interferes with itself, it ripples, it does whatever the equation tells it to do. None of this is mysterious. It is just a wave behaving like a wave. The mystery is what happens when you measure the particle. According to the Copenhagen interpretation, formulated by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg and the founding generation of quantum theorists, the wave function collapses at the moment of measurement. The cloud of possibilities shrinks instantaneously to a single point. The particle was a probability cloud, and now it is a single answer. One outcome happens, the others vanish, but nothing in the Schrödinger equation describes this process. The equation says one thing, the Copenhagen rule says another, and where they disagree, the Copenhagen rule wins, but only at the moment a measurement happens. The rest of the time, the equation reigns. This is a strange situation. Imagine a theory of falling apples that says, in writing, apples fall down at 9.8 meters per second squared, unless somebody is watching, in which case the apple chooses one of several possible landing spots, according to a probability distribution. You would not call that a complete theory. You would call it a hint of a theory, plus a footnote nobody had managed to absorb into the equations. That, in a real sense, was the state of quantum mechanics for the first 30 years of its life. The math worked. The interpretation around the math was an open wound. What changed, slowly, between Everett's thesis in 1957 and the present day is that physicists began to understand a process called decoherence. Decoherence is, in plain language, the unavoidable interaction of any quantum system with its environment. A particle in isolation can stay in superposition indefinitely. A particle in contact with air molecules, photons, vibrations, electrical noise, anything at all, very rapidly becomes entangled with all of that, and the part of the quantum state that survives as a clean superposition becomes effectively unmeasurable. Not gone, unmeasurable, the cloud of possibilities is still there in principle, but the interference between possibilities has been smeared across so many other particles that nobody could ever, in practice, recover it. The timescales here are not small. They are absurd. For a dust grain in normal air, Decoherence happens in approximately 10 to the negative 31 seconds. That is shorter than the Planck time, multiplied by 10,000. For a brain at body temperature, it is faster still. The reason you do not see a coffee mug in two places at once is not that the mug has somehow collapsed into one location, it is that the mug has decohered, entangled itself with so many surrounding particles that the superposition is, for all practical purposes, gone before it could ever be observed. When decoherence was first worked out, in the 1970s and 80s, it looked at first like a problem for the many worlds interpretation. People said, look, we never see superpositions, so the branches must not be real. But the longer physicists studied decoherence, the more they came to see it as an explanation, not an objection. Decoherence explains why you do not see the other branches. It does not require the other branches to vanish. The wave function just splits faster than any observer could ever notice, and the branches become invisible to each other forever. The Copenhagen collapse, looked at this way, was never a physical event. It was a description of what decoherence looks like from inside one branch. This is the shift that, more than anything else, brought the many worlds interpretation back from the footnotes. Physicists like David Deutsch at Oxford, who built the foundations of quantum computing in the 1980s, argued that the many worlds interpretation was the only reading that took the math literally. If you trust the Schrödinger equation, the equation says branches. The Copenhagen collapse is the patch. The patch is the thing that needs explaining, not the branches. Sean Carroll, the theoretical physicist at Caltech, has spent the better part of 2 decades making this case publicly, in books and podcasts and public lectures. His 2025 Mindscape podcast, in a July episode I went back and listened to while writing this script, makes the case as clearly as anything I have heard. Carroll points out that human beings are physical systems, made of the same matter as everything else, governed by the same equations as everything else. There is no special exemption for brains. If the Schrödinger equation applies to a measuring device, it applies to a measuring device plus a human observer, and the result is the same. The human observer branches along with the device. This matters because it removes the last remaining hiding place for the question we started with. When we asked, at the beginning of the video, what happens after the device cycles, we were not asking a philosophical question. We were asking what the Schrödinger equation does when it is applied to a situation in which the observer continues to exist in one branch and ceases to exist in another. And the answer is the same answer it gives for any other measurement. The equation does not collapse. It evolves. The branch in which the device triggers contains a quiet room. The branch in which it clicks contains an observer who, from the inside, is still there. Both branches are equally real. The Schrödinger equation does not distinguish between them. A useful number to hold in your mind. The Schrödinger equation and the broader framework of quantum mechanics it sits inside is one of the most experimentally verified pieces of mathematics in the history of human science. The most precise tests in a field called quantum electrodynamics agree with experiment to about 1 part in 10 to the 11th. That is roughly the precision of measuring the distance from New York to Los Angeles to within the width of a human hair. We are not talking about a speculative framework. We are talking about an equation that has never, once, in any controlled experiment, given a wrong answer. The same equation that is this precise about electrons is the equation that, when applied to a human observer in front of a quantum trigger, says branching. It is at this point that physicists tend to either flinch or get strangely quiet. Because if you accept the Schrödinger equation, and you accept that it applies to everything, including conscious observers, then you have to accept something about what happens when an observer is part of a quantum experiment. And the only thing you can refuse to accept is the idea that the many worlds interpretation has anything to say about conscious experience. You can say the branches are mathematical artifacts. You can say only the observed branch is real. You can say collapse is real, and we just have not figured out the mechanism. All of these are defensible positions. None of them are obviously more rigorous than the position that the equation means what it says. There is a famous survey of working physicists taken at a conference at the University of Maryland in 2013 that asked attendees which interpretation of quantum mechanics they favored. About 42% chose Copenhagen. About 18% chose many worlds. The rest was spread across pilot wave theory, objective collapse models, quantum Bayesianism, and various smaller positions. What is remarkable about this number is not that many worlds won, it is that the same survey, taken in 1970, would have shown almost nobody endorsing it at all. The interpretation is not consensus. It is not orthodoxy, but it is, very quietly, the position that has gone from fringe to one of the major contenders in the lifetime of physicists still working today. And once you take it seriously, you have to take the consequence seriously too. So, in the next part, we are going to do something uncomfortable. We are going to look at how often the Schrödinger equation is doing this branching in a system as ordinary as the inside of your own skull over a unit of time as ordinary as a second. The numbers, when you actually do the arithmetic, are not the kind of numbers human language has good words for, but the numbers are real. And they are the answer to the question of how many versions of you there are. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number, part 4. The branching of you, in numbers you can almost feel. The brain is a strange object to talk about in quantum mechanical terms. It is wet, it is warm, it is roughly 1.5 kilograms of fatty tissue at 37 degrees Celsius, and it is constantly interacting with its environment in a million small ways at every moment. Blood flow, electrical activity, chemical signaling, thermal vibrations from the metabolism of glucose. By every measure that matters for quantum coherence, the brain is a worst-case scenario. It is decoherence central. Whatever quantum events are happening inside it, they are interacting with their surroundings almost instantaneously. This is exactly why physicists who take the many worlds interpretation seriously can give you a rough estimate of how many branches your brain spawns every second. Because decoherence does not stop branches, it just makes them invisible to each other. Every quantum event in your brain that gets entangled with the rest of your brain, with your blood, with the air around you, with the photons leaving your eyes, contributes to a branching. And the brain has approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron processes signals on a timescale of milliseconds. Each one is in constant chemical and electrical interaction with thousands of others. Theorists who have tried to actually count this number, in a back-of-the-envelope way, have given numbers that look something like this. The branching rate of a single human brain over a single second of activity is in the neighborhood of 10 to the power of 10 to the 17. That is not 10 to the 17. That is a tower. 10 raised to a power that is itself 10 to the 17. Let me try to put this in a form your intuition can grip. There are about 10 to the 80th atoms in the observable universe. The branching rate of your brain in 1 second exceeds that number by a margin so absurd that human language does not really contain a word for it. You would need a word for a number whose digit count alone exceeds the atom count of the universe. We do not have such a word because we have never needed one. If you find that number hard to picture, here is another way to come at it. A single quantum event somewhere in your body that could plausibly affect your survival is something like a sodium channel in a cardiac muscle cell firing or not firing at exactly the wrong moment. Each beat of your pulse involves on the order of 10 to the 18 of these channels. Each one is a coin flip of sorts. Most of the time, the outcomes do not propagate up to anything that matters. Sometimes Very rarely, they do. Across 2.5 billion heartbeats in an average human lifetime, the number of branches in which one of those channels happen to misfire and trigger a fatal arrhythmia is under the many worlds interpretation, not zero. It is enormous. It is just that, from the inside, you happen to be the one who is still around to count the heartbeats. Think about that number. 2.5 billion heartbeats. 2.5 billion individual quantum opportunities for one specific ion channel in one specific muscle cell to do the wrong thing at the wrong instant. Every one of those moments, under the many worlds interpretation, is a fan of outcomes. In the bulk of the fan, the outcome is fine. The cell fires, the muscle contracts, the blood moves, the next heartbeat comes. In a small but non-zero fraction of the fan, the outcome is not fine. Those branches exist too. You are not in them. You are the version reading this sentence, in a continuous chain of survived heartbeats stretching back to your conception. Every single one of those heartbeats has, on this reading, branches where it did not happen. You are the version reporting from the chain where they all did. That is not a metaphor. That is what the math implies. If you take the math at face value, which is what working physicists like Sean Carroll have spent their careers arguing we should. Now, take one moment from your life. Pick something. The time you almost slipped on the stairs at age 4. The time the lump turned out to be nothing. The time you nearly missed your train but caught it and met someone you would later love. The time you decided not to take the route that, 10 minutes later, would have put you at an intersection with a drunk driver. Every one of these moments is a fan of outcomes. Every one of these moments, under the many worlds interpretation, has branches in which the outcome went the other way. The branch in which you slipped is real. The branch in which the lump was malignant is real. The branch in which you missed the train and never met that person is real. The branch in which the driver hit you is real. There is a moment in this kind of thinking, if you let yourself sit with it long enough, where the question stops being abstract. The question stops being, are there many worlds, and becomes, if there are, what does that mean for the version of me sitting here right now, having survived an unbroken chain of near misses for however many decades of life I have managed so far? And the honest answer is that the version of you sitting here right now is, under this interpretation, a person who has been walking a corridor of survived possibilities for as long as you have been alive. You did not get lucky. The branches in which you were not lucky also exist. You are simply the one who is here to file the report. Some people, when they sit with this for the first time, find a kind of strange quietness in it. The thought that you are one version among many, not the special one, just the one with first-person access. The thought that every choice you almost made is, somewhere, the choice that happened. The thought that every loss you have suffered is, in some branch, the loss that did not happen. The thought that you are not, in some metaphysical sense, irreplaceable. There are versions of you who took the other train. There are versions of you who said yes to the thing you said no to. There are versions of you who never moved away from the town you grew up in. Other people find it disquieting. Because if you let the thought finish, the same logic that gives you all those alternate lives also gives you something else. It gives you the recognition that, in this very branch, in this very life, there has never been a moment when survival was certain. Every breath you have taken is a coin that, in some other branch, came up the wrong way. The branch you are in is one of the survivors, by definition, because you are here to call it your branch. The Schrödinger equation, the equation that gives us this picture, is the most experimentally verified equation in physics. Quantum electrodynamics, the theory that uses it, matches experiment to roughly 1 part in 10 to the 11th. We are not standing on shaky ground when we say the equation is accurate. We are standing on the most solid ground in the history of human knowledge of nature. Whatever you do with the philosophical question, The math is not the part that is wobbly. The math has been right every single time we have checked. And the math, applied to a brain in a body in a world, says branching. It says that every moment of your life is the survivor's report from one filament of a structure too large to picture. It says that the people you love, who you have not lost, are, in some branch, gone. That the people you have lost are, in some branch, still here. That the choices you made are, in some branch, the choices you did not make. The math does not care which of these branches you find comforting. The math just keeps running. You might think, at this point, that someone like Max Tegmark, who actually wrote down the quantum survival thought experiment, would be the most committed defender of the personal immortality conclusion. After all, he is the one who walked the math right up to the edge of the question of what happens to a conscious observer. He is the one who said, in print, that if the many worlds interpretation is correct, the experimenter sitting in front of the device should expect to always find themselves alive. But Tegmark, in the years since, has walked his own conclusion back, not because the math changed, because he found a stranger version of the same problem. So in the next part, let me tell you why even the man who built the quantum survival thought experiment is afraid of it. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number part 5. Why even the theory's own inventor is afraid of it. Max Tegmark is, by training, a cosmologist. He has spent most of his career at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he has worked on questions about the structure of the early universe, the statistical properties of the cosmic microwave background, and the broader philosophical implications of taking modern physics literally. His public position has, over the years, included some of the most extreme readings of the implications of quantum mechanics that any mainstream physicist has been willing to put their name to. He has argued, in popular books, that there are at least 4 distinct kinds of multiverse implied by current physics, of which the many worlds interpretation is only one. He has argued that the universe is not just described by mathematics, but is in some sense made of mathematics. He is, in short, the kind of physicist who does not flinch from a strange conclusion. So when Tegmark, in interviews and public talks since the late 2000s, has said that he himself does not expect to experience subjective immortality, even if the many worlds interpretation is correct, it is worth paying attention to his reasoning. Because the reasoning is not the math is wrong, or I have changed my mind about Everett, the reasoning is more careful than that, and it does not, when you look at it closely, actually dissolve the question. It just moves the disturbing part somewhere else. Tegmark's main argument starts from a clinical observation. Real death, in the actual world of bodies and biology, is not the discrete event the thought experiment imagines. The quantum survival setup involves a single quantum event, perfectly correlated with a binary outcome, applied to a brain that is either fully alive or instantly gone. Real death does not look like that. Real death is a process. It takes seconds and minutes and sometimes hours. Brain cells die at different rates. Different cognitive functions wind down in different orders. Consciousness, in the clinical sense, fades. There is no single moment in a real human death where 1 second you are fully there and the next second you are entirely gone. There is a sliding scale. Tegmark's argument is that, on this sliding scale, the many worlds interpretation does not give you the clean teleport into a surviving branch picture that the thought experiment seems to imply. Instead, in most actual deaths, the branches that survive contain versions of you whose consciousness is itself partially destroyed. The branching does not preserve a clean conscious experience. It branches through the dying process, and the conscious experiences in the surviving branches are increasingly damaged. By the time you reach a branch where the dying event has been survived, in some loose sense, the conscious experience there may be too thin or too compromised to count as a continuation of the original consciousness. That is one argument. The other argument is the deeper one, and it is called the measure problem. Here is how the measure problem works. In the mathematics of the many worlds interpretation, branches do not all carry the same weight. The Schrödinger equation, when you derive probabilities from it using the Born rule, assigns each branch a number called the amplitude. The square of that number gives the relative weight of that branch. Some branches are thicker than others in this sense. The branches in which extremely improbable things happen, like surviving 100 consecutive quantum coin flips, exist, but they have weights that are unimaginably small. The puzzle is this. If all branches are equally real, what does it mean for one branch to have a small weight? In Copenhagen, the weight is a probability of being the branch that actually happens. But, under many worlds, all the branches happen. So what is the weight a probability of? The most common answer is that it is a probability about your subjective experience. You are more likely to find yourself in a heavy branch than a light one. But this requires a definition of the typical conscious observer. And that definition is one of the hardest open problems in the foundations of physics. If you accept this answer, the measure problem gives you a way out of strict quantum immortality. You can say, look, there are branches in which the experimenter survives 100 consecutive device cycles, but those branches have negligible measure. The typical observer, drawn from the multiverse according to the weights, is not in such a branch. The typical observer is in a branch where, according to ordinary probability, they did not make it past the third or fourth cycle. So, even though the surviving observer exists somewhere, you should not expect to be that observer. Your conscious experience should expect, statistically, to find itself in a branch where it has already ended. This is the argument Tegmark leans on when he says he does not expect to be subjectively immortal. It is the argument many philosophers of physics now consider the most rigorous response to strict quantum immortality, and it is a serious argument. But notice what it does, and what it does not do. What it does is shift the worry from you live forever to the measure of your continued conscious experience drops asymptotically towards zero, but never reaches it. That is not the same thing as you stop. It is a statement about the share of the multiverse occupied by branches in which you are still around. As you survive more and more improbable events, the share of the multiverse in which you exist becomes smaller and smaller. But it never quite vanishes, because there is always some branch in which the next event went the way you survived it. What this answer means, taken at face value, is that the version of you who is having a conscious experience right now is sliding into thinner and thinner branches every time something almost kills you. Your conscious experience, if it follows the Born-weighted branches at all, is becoming a smaller and smaller fraction of the structure of the universe with every brush with death. You are not getting closer to non-existence. You are getting closer to becoming a smaller and smaller share of what exists. This is, on close examination, not actually a comfortable answer. It is just a different version of an uncomfortable one. The strict quantum immortality conclusion says you can never end. The measure-corrected version says you can end, statistically, but in any branch where you ended, you cannot be there to confirm it, and in branches where you did not end, you are progressively occupying a thinner and thinner slice of reality. From the inside, in any single branch, you cannot tell the difference between these two pictures. You just keep being there. Which is the situation we started with. There is one more wrinkle. The argument that there is a typical observer, weighted by Born probabilities, requires that conscious experience samples branches according to those probabilities. Nobody has a satisfying derivation of why it should. Why should consciousness follow the Born rule? Why should the measure of a branch be interpreted as a likelihood of subjective experience, when, by hypothesis, all branches are equally real. David Deutsch has tried to derive this from decision theory. Other physicists have tried other approaches. None of them are universally accepted. The measure problem is one of the deepest open questions in modern foundations of physics, and the strict version of quantum immortality is, in part, a consequence of the fact that nobody has solved it. So when Tegmark says he does not expect to be subjectively immortal, he is not saying, this isn't a problem. He is saying, given some reasonable assumptions about how conscious experience samples the multiverse, the worst-case version of the problem softens to a slow fade. That is the honest scientific position. It is also a position that, depending on how you sit with it, can feel like a kind of comfort or like a darker version of the same disturbing argument. Because a slow fade across an endless sequence of branches in which you survived progressively more catastrophic events is not, when you think about it, what most people imagine when they imagine dying. All of which assumes the question we are asking is about branches in a multiverse outside your skull. What if the branches are happening inside your skull? What if consciousness itself is the quantum object? That is not a fringe idea. A Nobel laureate in physics, a man who shared the 2020 Nobel Prize for his work on black holes, has been arguing for 30 years that consciousness is, at its base, a quantum phenomenon. And if he is right, then the question of whether your conscious experience can end stops being a question about other universes. It becomes a question about the inside of your head. So let me tell you about Roger Penrose, and about an idea called orchestrated objective reduction is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number, part 6, consciousness as a quantum object. Roger Penrose is one of the most decorated mathematicians and physicists of the late 20th century. He shared the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in the 1960s, showing that, under the framework of general relativity, the formation of black holes is a robust prediction of Einstein's theory. He invented Penrose tilings, the mathematical patterns of non-repeating tile arrangements that turned out, decades later, to exist in nature in a class of materials called quasicrystals. He wrote a book in 1989 called The Emperor's New Mind, in which he argued, against most of the cognitive science establishment, that consciousness cannot be reduced to ordinary computation. He has been one of the most independent and stubborn voices in physics for the last 60 years, and the people who disagree with him tend to do so respectfully, because his track record of being right about things nobody thought he could be right about is unusually long. In 1994, Penrose began collaborating with an anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff, who worked at the University of Arizona. Hameroff had spent years thinking about a question that the rest of medicine had mostly stopped asking. How does anesthesia work? Not in the sense of which receptors it binds to or which neurotransmitters it blocks, but in the deeper sense of how a chemical you breathe in can make consciousness disappear and then come back without any memory of the gap. Hameroff had a hypothesis. He thought anesthetic drugs interfered with structures inside neurons called microtubules. Microtubules are tiny hollow tubes built out of a protein called tubulin that exist inside every cell in your body. In neurons, they are particularly abundant, and they play important roles in the cell's structure and in the transport of chemical signals along the cell's long, thin arms. They are about 25 nanometers across. They are, in other words, structures small enough that quantum effects might, in principle, matter to their behavior. Penrose and Hameroff put together a hypothesis they called orchestrated objective reduction, or OR for short. The hypothesis has two parts. The first part is a claim about consciousness. They argue that consciousness arises from quantum computations happening inside microtubules, and that each moment of conscious experience corresponds to a particular kind of quantum collapse event called an objective reduction. The second part is a claim about the rate. They argue that these objective reduction events happen at a frequency of roughly 40 per second, which would match the rate of gamma oscillations measured in brains during waking conscious experience. The objective reduction part comes from Penrose's broader work in physics. Penrose has long held that the wave function does, in fact, collapse, but that the collapse is not caused by observation. He argues that quantum superpositions become unstable when they involve enough mass and energy difference to matter to gravity, and that gravity itself causes them to collapse after a calculable amount of time. This is a controversial position. Most physicists do not believe that gravity causes wave function collapse. But Penrose's argument is mathematically careful, and it makes a specific quantitative prediction. He calculates that a superposition involving a mass of about 10 to the negative 7 kilograms should collapse on a timescale of about 1/25th of a second. That is, suggestively, the same timescale as a single conscious moment. So the picture Penrose and Hameroff propose is this. Inside the microtubules of your neurons, quantum superpositions form. They are protected from environmental decoherence for a brief moment, somewhere on the order of 10 to the negative 13 seconds. They grow in mass energy. When they cross Penrose's gravitational threshold, they collapse, all at once, in a single objective reduction event. That event is a moment of conscious experience. And the next one is the next moment. 40 times a second, your conscious experience is being built up out of discrete quantum collapses inside the tiny tubes that make up the skeleton of your neurons. When this idea was first proposed, in the early 1990s, most neuroscientists thought it was preposterous. The standard argument was that brains are too warm and too wet and too noisy for quantum coherence to survive long enough to do anything interesting. The decoherence times for quantum systems at body temperature should be far too short for microtubules to sustain meaningful quantum behavior. The idea got filed in the same drawer as 100 other speculative theories of consciousness, mostly to be ignored. Then, in 2014, a group of researchers, led by Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, reported experimental evidence of quantum vibrations in microtubules at biologically relevant temperatures. The findings, published in Physics of Life Reviews, suggested that microtubules might actually be capable of sustaining the kind of coherent quantum activity that OR required. This did not prove the theory was correct, but it removed the main objection that had been keeping it filed away. Then, more recently, in 2025, a review paper appeared in the journal Frontiers in Human Neuroscience titled The Quantum Classical Complexity of Consciousness and Orchestrated Objective Reduction. The paper, authored by a team of researchers continuing the Penrose and Hameroff program, argued that quantum synchronization across many microtubules could create a unified quantum state, and that a phenomenon called superradiance, where many quantum emitters cooperate to produce a coherent collective signal, might be the mechanism by which separate microtubules in different neurons get knit together into a single conscious moment. The paper does not prove the theory, but it shows that the idea is being developed inside peer-reviewed neuroscience journals by working researchers in 2025. The fringe label, accurately or not, no longer quite fits. What does this have to do with quantum immortality? The answer is the central point of this section. If consciousness is itself a quantum phenomenon, then everything we said in the first half of this video about branching applies directly to consciousness. The same Schrödinger equation that splits the particle splits the conscious moment. Each objective reduction event, if OR is correct, is a quantum event, and quantum events under the many worlds interpretation do not have single outcomes. They branch. So the question of whether your conscious experience can end is no longer just a question about whether some version of you keeps existing somewhere in a multiverse outside your head. It becomes a question about what happens when a quantum collapse event tries to produce a result that includes no consciousness here. Because under many worlds, that result, if it has any quantum amplitude at all, is paired with another result that includes consciousness here. And the consciousness, by the same definition we used earlier, can only ever have an inside view of the branch where it continued. Hameroff has gone further. He has speculated in interviews and lectures that near-death experiences are real quantum information leaking out of microtubules during clinical death and returning when circulation is re-established. This is not accepted by most neuroscientists. The mainstream view is that near-death experiences are the predictable result of dying brain chemistry. But Hameroff's speculation is at least coherent with his theoretical framework. If consciousness lives in the quantum state of microtubules, then the quantum state has to go somewhere when those structures stop working. Where it goes, in Hameroff's reading, is back into the broader quantum substrate of the universe, where it might persist long enough to be recovered if the body is brought back online. I want to be careful here, because there is a long history of consciousness as quantum theories being misused by people who want to sell you crystals. The Penrose-Hameroff theory is not that. It is a specific, mathematically articulated, experimentally testable hypothesis about a specific class of cellular structures and a specific timescale of quantum activity. It can be tested. It is being tested. It might be wrong. Roger Penrose himself has acknowledged that the theory could be falsified by experiments still to come. The honest scientific position is that OR is contested. It is one of several candidate frameworks for understanding what consciousness is, and it is the one that takes the quantum question most seriously. But the very fact that a Nobel laureate in physics, working with a serious anesthesiologist, has been developing this theory for 30 years tells you something important. It tells you that the boundary between what physics says and what happens to you is much thinner than the popular picture allows. The question of whether your conscious experience is a fundamentally quantum object is, today, not a question physics has been able to dismiss. It is a question physics has had to take more seriously, not less, as the experimental support has crept in. And once you take it seriously, the quantum immortality argument transforms. It stops being a story about other universes. It becomes a story about the inside of your skull, and about the quantum events that, 40 times a second, are what your conscious experience is. The same equation that has been generating the branching all along is the equation that, on this reading, is also generating the conscious moments. The branching is the conscious moments. The conscious moments are the branching. There is no separation, which connects directly back to where we have been. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, and if OR is correct, then the central thread of this video, the claim that your conscious experience cannot end, becomes not a metaphysical riddle about which branch your consciousness tracks, but a physical statement about what conscious experience actually is. It is a sequence of quantum collapses inside your microtubules. Each one branches. The conscious experience, by definition, follows the branches in which it continues to exist, and the equation never stops running. Whether OR is right or wrong, the bigger lesson here is the same. Modern physics has not been able to make the question of conscious survival go away by relegating it to a separate metaphysical category. The math keeps running into the conscious observer, and the conscious observer keeps being made of the same stuff as everything else. So the question of what happens to your conscious experience when it brushes against death is not a question physics is allowed to wave away. It is a question the equations themselves keep raising. Suppose all of this is true. Suppose your conscious experience does keep going across surviving branches, whether outside your skull or inside it. The next question is not whether that survival is real. The next question is whether you would want it. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number, part 7, the corridor of catastrophic survival. If you have been following the argument carefully so far, you might be thinking that the disturbing part of quantum immortality is that you live forever. That is not the disturbing part. That is the headline. The disturbing part is what you live forever as. Because the surviving branches are not, on the whole, the branches in which the dying event was averted cleanly, the surviving branches are, statistically, the branches in which something terrible happened and you somehow did not die from it. A paper appeared late in 2025 on ResearchGate, an open repository of academic papers, titled The Paradox of Eternal Suffering in Quantum Immortality. It is a philosophical analysis, not a piece of experimental physics, but it puts a precise finger on something that has been hovering around this conversation since Tegmark first wrote down the quantum survival thought experiment. The paper's argument is straightforward. The immortality conclusion is only comforting if you assume survival means you wake up in a happier branch. But survival can mean many other things. It can mean you wake up in a branch where you survived the stroke, but the stroke took the use of your right side. It can mean you wake up in a branch where you survived the car accident, but the car accident took your memory. It can mean you wake up in a branch where you survived the cardiac arrest, but the cardiac arrest left you in a state that the doctors call vegetative. In the actual world of medicine, every traumatic event has a fan of outcomes. On one end of the fan, full recovery. On the other end, death. In between, a long corridor of partial survivals, comas, locked-in syndrome, where you are fully conscious but cannot move or speak, permanent vegetative states. Severe traumatic brain injury, anoxic brain damage from a cardiac arrest where the resuscitation came just in time to save the brainstem but not the cortex. Each of these is, in the language of clinical medicine, a survival. None of them is the survival you would choose if you had a choice. Under the many worlds interpretation, every outcome on this fan exists. Death exists in some branches. Full recovery exists in others. The corridor of partial survivals exists in the bulk of them. And, under the consciousness tracking conclusion we have been developing, your conscious experience cannot follow the branch where you died. By hypothesis, that branch has no first person to follow. So your conscious experience must follow one of the surviving branches. Some of those are full recoveries. Some of those are the corridor. The dark insight in the 2025 philosophy paper is that the corridor is, statistically, larger than the full recoveries. For any sufficiently severe traumatic event, the branches in which you survived with no lasting harm are a small subset of the branches in which you survived. The branches in which you survived, but in a damaged state, are the majority. So, if your conscious experience must follow a surviving branch, and if the surviving branches are mostly damaged, then your conscious experience is statistically expected to find itself in a damaged state. You are not afraid of dying under this reading. You are afraid of not dying when not dying was supposed to be the merciful option. Let me make this more concrete, because the abstract version of the argument is easier to dismiss than the concrete one. Imagine you have a stroke. In our world, the stroke is fatal. In another branch, the stroke is non-fatal but takes the use of your right side. In another branch, the stroke is non-fatal but leaves you with severe aphasia, the inability to produce or understand language. In another branch, the stroke is non-fatal but takes the parts of you that recognize faces. There are many other branches. Most of the branches in which you survive at all are branches in which something was taken. Under the consciousness tracking conclusion, your conscious experience finds itself in one of the surviving branches. It is, statistically, much more likely to find itself in a branch where something was taken than in a branch where nothing was. Now make it cumulative. Every brush with death across your whole life is a fan of outcomes. Across a lifetime of ordinary human existence, you walk down a corridor of survivals. By statistics, the typical branch you find yourself in becomes, over time, one in which every threshold of catastrophe was crossed, and you survived it. The longer you go, the more of these thresholds accumulate. The branches in which you survived all of them, with no damage, are a smaller and smaller share of the surviving branches. The branches in which you survived all of them with accumulating damage are the bulk. This is the corridor of catastrophic survival. The name is from the philosophy paper, but the idea is older. It is what the strict quantum immortality conclusion really implies. Not eternal life. Eternal, not dying. There is, of course, a counter-argument. Tegmark's gradual death answer pushes back here too. If consciousness fades gradually rather than persisting as a discrete object that branches, then maybe the catastrophic survival branches are also fading. Maybe the conscious experience in them is too damaged to count as you persisting. Maybe the version of you in a permanent vegetative state with no measurable cortical activity is not really you in any meaningful sense, and the consciousness tracking argument simply doesn't apply. This is a reasonable response, but it has its own problem. Too damaged to count as you is a threshold, and thresholds in this kind of argument are notoriously slippery. At what point does the version of you in that branch stop being you? Is it when you lose your memories? Many people with severe amnesia are still considered the same person by the people who love them. Is it when you lose the use of your body? Stephen Hawking did most of his greatest work after losing the use of nearly all of his body. Is it when you lose language? People with severe aphasia retain full inner lives. The question of where you stops and not you begins in a single universe with a single body is one of the hardest questions in philosophy. Multiplying it by infinity does not make it easier. There is also the question of which of the catastrophic survival states would actually count, on the inside, as continuous conscious experience. Locked-in syndrome, for example, is fully conscious. Patients in locked-in syndrome retain their full cognitive function, their memories, their personalities. They simply cannot move or speak. There are documented cases of patients in locked-in syndrome communicating, after years, through eye movements, who report that they are still themselves. They still have an inside view. If you ended up in that state, in some branch, the consciousness tracking argument says your conscious experience could follow that branch. It would be you, locked in. I do not say this to scare you. I say it because the honest argument requires that we sit with it. The disturbing thing about quantum immortality is not the abstract horror of going on forever. It is the specific weight of a thought that doctors and nurses and ethicists and families already grapple with every day, in actual hospitals, in actual rooms, where actual humans are kept alive in states they would never have chosen. The corridor is not a thought experiment. The corridor is, in our ordinary one-universe sense, already real. The many worlds interpretation, if it is right, just makes it the statistically expected destination. Some philosophers have argued that this is why we have a moral intuition that quick deaths are kinder than slow ones, that the intuition is, in a strange way, multiverse aware, that when we say someone went peacefully, we are recognizing that the alternative was the corridor. Whether or not that argument is right, it is interesting that it can be made. There is a clinical phenomenon that, in our ordinary one-universe sense, gestures in the same direction. Doctors who work in intensive care units have long described what they call the trajectory problem. A patient comes in after a major event, a stroke, a cardiac arrest, a severe head injury. the medical team can usually save the patient's life. The question is, which life they are saving. Sometimes the patient walks out of the hospital weeks later, fully recovered, with a story to tell. Sometimes the patient walks out in a wheelchair, with a slower version of their old self. Sometimes the patient does not walk out at all, but goes to a long-term care facility and stays there for years. The medical staff cannot, in advance, tell which trajectory any individual patient is on. They can only watch it unfold. In the language of the many worlds interpretation, every patient is, in the seconds after the event, a fan of possible trajectories. From inside any single branch, the trajectory only becomes visible as it happens, which is precisely the situation the corridor describes, made flesh, in actual hospital rooms, every single day. What I want to leave you with, before we move on, is the recognition that the central thread of this video is not, in the end, a horror story. It is a much quieter thing. It is the recognition that taking the math of quantum mechanics seriously, all the way down to the question of conscious experience, does not produce comforting answers. It produces a picture in which death is not the worst possible outcome of a fatal event, but the easiest one, where survival, in its full range of branches, is the thing that asks more of you, where the question is not whether your conscious experience can end, but what it has to go through if it cannot. If the corridor is real, you should expect to see something in the world. You should expect old people to be living to impossibly old ages. You should expect the world to be full of survivors who, statistically, should not have made it. You do not see that. The cemeteries are not empty. The 150-year-old marathon runners are not common. So either the strict quantum immortality argument is wrong, or the answer to the old age question is even stranger than the immortality argument. So let me show you what the old age problem really is. Is less than break time equals 1s, is greater than number, part 8, the old age problem. If quantum immortality is real, where are the immortals? That is the most natural question to ask, and it is the question that almost every conversation about this topic eventually arrives at. If your conscious experience must follow the surviving branches forever, then the world should be full of people who, by ordinary statistics, should be long dead. The cemeteries should be a contradiction. The average age at a busy intersection should be enormous. The oldest verified human in history should not be a 122-year-old French woman named Jeanne Calment. The oldest verified human should be older than recorded history. We do not see this. The cemeteries are full. People die at roughly the ages. Life insurance actuaries say they will. The oldest verified humans cluster, with frustrating regularity, around 110 to 120 years. Jeanne Calment, who lived from 1875 to 1997, holds the record at 122 years and 164 days. Nobody, in any reliably documented case, has ever passed 124. This is exactly what ordinary, single-universe biology predicts. There is no statistical signal of quantum immortality. There is no hint, in the population data, of conscious experience accumulating in branches that beat the actuarial odds. So either the strict quantum immortality argument is wrong, or there is an explanation for why we do not see it. There are three main candidate answers, and each of them is interesting on its own terms. The first candidate answer is Tegmark's gradual fade. Consciousness, in this picture, is not a discrete object that branches. It is a process that runs down as the body and brain run down. By the time you reach an extremely advanced age, the conscious experience in those branches is too thin to count as continuous experience. You do not wake up at 150 in some surviving branch, because by the time you are statistically alive at 150, the conscious experience there is so degraded that it does not behave like a person. It is too damaged to count. Under this answer, the corridor of catastrophic survival from the previous part eventually thins itself out by simply ending the conscious experience in a soft, gradual way, rather than a sharp branching way. The second candidate answer is the measure problem we talked about in Part 5, the branches in which a person survives to extraordinarily old ages exist, but they are vanishingly thin in measure. So while they exist, the typical observer, sampled by Born rule weight, does not find themselves there. The bulk of the conscious experience in the multiverse, weighted properly, is concentrated in branches where ordinary actuarial mortality applies. The branches with the immortals are real, but, in any meaningful statistical sense, you are unlikely to be in one of them. The candidate answer is the disturbing one. Old people in extreme branches are living to absurd ages. We just happen not to be in those branches. And under the many worlds interpretation, happen not to be does not mean do not exist. It means there is a version of you, right now, in one of those branches, having that experience. You will never meet that version. That version is not you, in the sense of being on this side of the branch, but that version is also exactly as you, as the version sitting here right now, reading these words. There is no fact about the multiverse, only an inside view from a single thread of it. If you take this third answer seriously, you have to grapple with a much older problem in philosophy, the problem of personal identity. Across branches, what makes a version of you, you? Is it memory? Is it physical continuity? Is it the conscious experience itself? John Locke, writing in the late 17th century, argued that personal identity over time depends on continuity of memory. If today's you remembers being yesterday's you, then they are the same person. By Locke's criterion, the version of you in the surviving branch is you exactly to the extent that they remember being the version of you who almost died. By Locke's criterion, the version of you at 150 in some absurd surviving branch is still you if their memories chain back through all the survivals to the you sitting here right now. But Locke's criterion has its own problems. People with severe memory disorders are usually still considered the same person by those who love them, even when their memories no longer chain. People who change radically over decades are usually still considered the same person. The question of what makes someone you is, in our ordinary single universe sense, already messy. Take it into the many worlds interpretation, and it becomes an entire ocean. There is a thought experiment that, I think, gets at the disturbing version of the old age problem most cleanly. Imagine a version of you who has, by sheer accumulation of survived near misses, lived to 120. From the inside, that version does not feel immortal. They feel like a person who has been lucky. They had several close calls. They survived a car accident in their 30s. They survived cancer in their 50s. They survived a cardiac arrest at 78 that the doctor said, by all rights, should have killed them. They survived the pneumonia at 96. They have, in their own self-report, just been a very lucky person. That is, on the inside, exactly what immortality looks like under the many worlds interpretation. You cannot tell, from inside a single branch, whether you have been having a normal life or a corridor of catastrophic survival life. Both feel the same from the inside. The branch you are in feels normal because it is the only branch you have access to. You can see where this is going. If you cannot distinguish from the inside between an ordinary life and a series of consciously experienced quantum immortality survivals, then how confident are you that the things you remember about your own life are not, in some places, the records of a string of survivals that, from outside any single branch, should never have happened? This is not a comforting thought experiment. It is a strange one. It does not say you are immortal. It says that you cannot, from inside a branch, distinguish between being immortal and being lucky, because both feel the same. The honest framing is that we do not, on a population level, see the signal of quantum immortality. Cemeteries are full. Maximum verified ages cluster around the predictions of single-universe biology. So one of the three candidate answers must be doing the work. Either consciousness fades gradually before the corridor gets long enough to be visible, or the measure-corrected typical observer is in normal life branches, or the immortals are real, but spread across so many branches that we, on this side, do not get to meet them. Each of these has different implications for the strict immortality argument. The first softens the argument by suggesting consciousness does end, just gradually. The second softens the argument by suggesting that you should statistically expect to be in normal life branches. The third does not soften the argument at all. It simply explains why we do not see it. The version of you in the absurd surviving branch is real. You will never meet them. From here, the branches are silent. What you can do, though, is sit with the recognition that comes after you finish that thought. The recognition that there are versions of you on the other side of every close call you have ever had, who came out the other way. Some of them are still alive, in branches where the math left them alive. Some of them are not. Some of them are in the corridor. Some of them are old, in ways no one in our branch has ever been. If you cannot tell from the inside the difference between a normal life and a survivor's life, then how confident are you about what you remember? How confident are you that the things you remember about reality are the things that actually happened? Because if branches are nearly identical and conscious experience can drift between similar branches, then a memory might not be a record of this branch. It might be a record of a slightly different one. So in the next part, let me show you the strangest implication of this, which is that the popular intuition about something called the Mandela effect might, accidentally, be doing folk physics. And the older cosmological idea behind it, called the Boltzmann brain, might be telling you that the version of you experiencing this conscious moment is not, statistically, a continuous person at all. Is less than break time equals 1s is greater than number part 9. Boltzmann brains, the Mandela effect, and the things that leak. The central thread we have been following all video is that under the many worlds interpretation, your conscious experience cannot end, and you cannot fully trust the branch you are in to be the branch you think you are in. These next three ideas are the strangest implications of that, and I want to walk through them one at a time, because each of them is interesting on its own, and together they describe something about the picture of consciousness that physics has, very quietly, drifted toward. The first idea is the Boltzmann brain. The name comes from Ludwig Boltzmann, the 19th century Austrian physicist who, more than anyone else, figured out the connection between thermodynamics and the statistical behavior of large numbers of particles. Boltzmann's basic insight was that entropy, the tendency of systems to move from ordered states to disordered ones, is a statistical phenomenon. Ordered states are rare, disordered states are common. The reason we see the universe moving from order to disorder, on the whole, is that there are just more ways for things to be disordered than ordered. But, and this is the part that matters here, over a long enough time, even very rare ordered states will, by chance, fluctuate into existence. If the universe is infinite in extent or in duration, then any configuration of particles that is physically possible will, given enough time, occur somewhere, including configurations of particles that look like a fully formed human brain, complete with memories, sitting in a coherent moment of experience, and then dissipating back into thermodynamic chaos. These hypothetical thermodynamic flukes are called Boltzmann brains. A Boltzmann brain has all the appearance, from the inside, of being a continuous conscious person. It has memories of a past it never had. It has impressions of a body and a world that in fact are not there. It exists for, say, a fraction of a second. and then it falls apart back into the background noise from which it was assembled. The problem the Boltzmann brain raises for modern cosmology is not whether such brains exist. They almost certainly do, somewhere, in any sufficiently large universe. The problem is whether they are, statistically, the typical kind of conscious experience. The argument goes like this. In an infinite or very long-lived universe, the number of moments of conscious experience generated by ordinary biological brains, like ours, embedded in continuous histories, is finite. The number of moments of conscious experience generated by Boltzmann brain fluctuations, given infinite time and enough thermodynamic activity, is also potentially enormous. Depending on the cosmology you assume, the second number might be larger, possibly far larger. If the second number is larger, then a randomly chosen conscious moment, drawn from the multiverse, is more likely to be a Boltzmann brain than a continuous biological brain. Which means your conscious experience right now, statistically, is more likely to be a thermodynamic flash than the moment of a continuous person reading a script. The fact that you feel continuous is no evidence either way. A Boltzmann brain, by definition, would feel exactly as continuous as you do right now, because it would have been assembled with all the appropriate memories of continuity built in. This is, in modern cosmology, a real problem. It is called the Boltzmann brain problem, and it is one of the criteria physicists use to evaluate cosmological models. A model that predicts a multiverse in which Boltzmann brains vastly outnumber ordinary observers is considered, by most working cosmologists, a model that is probably wrong in some way. The reasoning is anthropic. If we are typical observers, and the model predicts most observers are Boltzmann brains, then either we are not typical or the model is wrong. The connection back to quantum immortality. Boltzmann brains do not refute the immortality argument. They complicate it. They show that the question of what counts as a continuous conscious experience is harder than the immortality argument might have suggested. You might be experiencing immortality in the strict sense, as a continuous biological consciousness threading through surviving branches. Or you might be experiencing a Boltzmann brain flash, complete with manufactured memories of a long life. From the inside, the two are indistinguishable. The many worlds interpretation does not, on its own, tell you which one you are. Both possibilities exist in any sufficiently large multiverse. The argument that your conscious experience cannot end is, in a Boltzmann brain reading, replaced by the argument that your conscious experience might never have started at all. The second idea is the Mandela effect. This one is much closer to ordinary life. The term comes from a paranormal researcher named Fiona Broome, who in 2009 noticed that she and many other people remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, when in fact he had been released and had served as president of South Africa and had died of a respiratory infection in 2013. Broome and others started cataloguing other cases of widely shared false memories. The Berenstain Bears, the children's book series, remembered by many as the Berenstain Bears. The Monopoly board game's mascot, remembered by many as wearing a monocle, which he does not wear and never has. Pikachu's tail, remembered by many as ending in a black tip, which it does not. Most of these are, almost certainly, ordinary memory effects. Human memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. We do not store memories like videos. We rebuild them every time we recall them, using a mixture of stored fragments and current expectations and cultural context. When a population of people share similar expectations and similar cultural context, they will often reconstruct memories with similar errors. The Mandela effect, on this reading, is a predictable consequence of how memory actually works. There is nothing supernatural about it. But there is a strain of online culture that treats the Mandela effect as evidence of branch-sliding consciousness. The idea goes that Under the many worlds interpretation, branches are nearly identical, and the differences between them are small: a spelling, a logo, a tail tip. Conscious experience, in this folk reading, occasionally slides between nearly identical branches and brings partial memories with it, producing the impression that something has changed when in fact you have moved. This is not science. It is not evidence. But there is something interesting about it. The popular intuition for what the many worlds interpretation would feel like, from the inside, has converged on exactly the kind of micro differences that branching would, in principle, produce. People are doing, without realizing it, folk physics. They are using the many worlds interpretation as a metaphor for a felt experience of small inconsistencies in memory, and the metaphor happens to fit the shape of what the math actually allows. Neighboring branches in the many worlds interpretation would in fact differ by tiny details. The differences would be small: a spelling, a logo, a tail tip. None of this proves anything. But it shows that the public intuition for branching consciousness has leaked into ordinary culture, where it does not belong, but where it has, apparently, found something to attach itself to. The third idea is Wigner's friend. This was a thought experiment proposed by the physicist Eugene Wigner in 1961. Wigner imagined his friend inside a sealed laboratory, performing a quantum measurement on a particle, while Wigner himself stood outside the laboratory and could not see what was happening inside. From the friend's perspective, the measurement is performed and the result is definite. The friend sees an outcome. From Wigner's perspective, however, the friend and the apparatus and the particle and the room are all just one big quantum system, evolving according to the Schrödinger equation. From outside, Wigner has not collapsed anything. The friend, plus the apparatus, plus the result, are all in a superposition. Wigner intended this as an argument that consciousness must cause collapse. The argument went, the friend's conscious observation must be the thing that makes the result definite, because no purely physical interaction inside the room could do it. The friend has a conscious experience, and that experience picks one outcome. Wigner, outside, who has no conscious access to the inside of the room, sees only superposition until the friend tells him the result. Under the many worlds interpretation, Wigner's friend resolves cleanly without requiring consciousness to do any special physical work. Both the friend and Wigner see definite results in their respective branches. The friend sees one outcome inside the lab. Wigner, when the friend eventually tells him, finds himself in the branch in which the friend reports that outcome. The other branch, where the friend reports the other outcome, also exists and contains its own version of Wigner, who is also informed. There is no contradiction. The outside view and inside view are just descriptions of the same branched reality seen from different observers' positions in it. The connection back to quantum immortality. Wigner's friend matters for our central thread because it raises the question of who counts as an observer. If observation requires consciousness in some special way, then maybe quantum immortality does not apply to brains that are too damaged to count as conscious. Maybe the corridor of catastrophic survival ends at the point where the brain stops being a meaningful observer. Maybe the immortality argument is bounded by something we do not yet understand about what consciousness is. If observation does not require consciousness, on the other hand, then immortality might extend even further than the strictest reading suggests, because the branching is happening at the level of physical systems, regardless of whether anyone is there to experience it. The cumulative effect of these three ideas, Boltzmann brains, the Mandela effect, and Wigner's friend, are all different angles on the same uncomfortable point. The picture you have of being one continuous you, in one continuous branch, with continuous memory, is doing a lot of work that the underlying physics does not necessarily support. The Boltzmann brain says you might not be continuous. The Mandela effect, taken as folk physics, says you might be in nearly identical branches sliding past each other. Wigner's friend says the boundary of what counts as you as an observer is fuzzy. Each of these complicates the immortality argument. None of them dissolves it. They just show how much of the comfort of ordinary self-identity depends on assumptions about consciousness that quantum mechanics quietly undermines. Each of these three ideas is a different version of the same question: quantum immortality forces. What exactly is the conscious experience that the math says cannot end, and how confident can you be that the version of it you are having right now is what you think it is? You feel like one continuous person. You feel like the same person who started this video. The math, taken seriously, does not unambiguously support any of those feelings. They might all be right. They might all be partly wrong. From the inside, you cannot tell. There is one more layer of strangeness, one that does not even require quantum mechanics to get going. Because Einstein's theory of relativity, confirmed in experiment after experiment for over a century now, already says something disturbing about time. It says that the past and the future are equally real. Combine that with the many worlds interpretation, and you get a picture of reality that none of our intuitions were built to handle. So before we close, let me show you, very briefly, the block universe. Is less than break time equals 1s. Is greater than number, part 10, the block universe, the Eternalist trap, and why relativity was already strange. Albert Einstein's theories of special and general relativity, taken at face value, imply something philosophers call eternalism. The picture is sometimes called the block universe. The idea is that past, present, and future are all equally real, and that the apparent flow of time is a feature of how observers experience the universe from their position within it, not a feature of the universe itself. The argument is short and, when you first encounter it, slightly unsettling. Special relativity says that the relationship between space and time depends on the observer's motion. Two observers in different states of motion will disagree about which events count as simultaneous. The classic example involves a train and a platform, where lightning strikes the front and back of the train at moments that the platform observer counts as simultaneous, but which the moving train observer counts as occurring at different times. There is no fact of the matter about which observer is right. Both are correct in their own reference frames. What this means is that the present is observer-dependent. There is no objective now that exists across the universe. Different observers in different states of motion will draw the line of the present moment through different events. And once you accept that, the argument that follows is sharp. If there is no objective present, and if the past was once present and the future will once be present, then past, present, and future must all be equally real. The events of the past are not gone. The events of the future are not yet to come. They are simply at different locations in a four-dimensional structure, that is, as a whole, what we mean by reality. The block universe is not fringe. It is the natural reading of relativity, and it is what most working physicists, including Einstein himself, have believed follows from his theories. Einstein, in a letter written shortly after the death of his close friend Michel Besso in 1955, wrote that the distinction between past, present, and future is a stubborn illusion. He meant it in exactly this sense. Time, in the block universe, does not flow. The structure simply exists, four-dimensionally, and we move through it the way a film projector moves through frames, except that the frames are all there at once, and the projector is the local pattern of consciousness reading them. Now, combine this picture with the many worlds interpretation. You do not get a single four-dimensional block. You get a four-dimensional branching crystal. Every possible you, at every possible age, in every possible branch, permanently inscribed in the same structure. Your past self is there. Your future self is there. The versions of you on every alternative branch are there. None of them is later than any other. All of them simply are. This is, on close examination, the most extravagant ontology in the history of science. The physicist David Deutsch, one of the founders of quantum computing and one of the most committed defenders of the many worlds interpretation, has called it that explicitly. A single block universe under relativity contains every event that ever was or will be. A many worlds block universe contains every event that ever was or will be in every branch of every quantum decision, all of them equally real, all of them four-dimensionally inscribed. The connection back to the central thread of this video, the many worlds argument, says your conscious experience cannot end. The block universe argument, on its own, says your conscious experience never started or ended in any flowing sense, because the structure of reality does not flow. The two together suggest that the comforting picture of "I exist for a while and then I stop" is not actually how reality works in either direction. There is no "for a while" if there is no flowing time. There are just inscriptions of conscious moments in a structure that contains all of them at once, in every branch. You can resist this. There are serious modern philosophers who defend presentism, the view that only the present moment is real and that the past and the future do not exist. The most prominent recent defender of presentism is the philosopher Dean Zimmerman at Rutgers, who has spent years working on whether presentism can be made consistent with relativity. Some physicists, including some who work on quantum gravity, also resist the block universe reading, arguing that time might be more fundamental than relativity suggests. The block universe is the natural reading. It is not the only one, but it is, taken at face value, the picture that most directly takes relativity seriously, the same way the many worlds interpretation is the picture that most directly takes the Schrödinger equation seriously. Both pictures arise from physicists asking the same question. What does the math say if we do not bolt on extra rules to make it say what we want? The answer, in relativity, is the block universe. The answer, in quantum mechanics, is the many worlds interpretation. Put them together, and you get a structure that contains every conscious moment of every version of you at every point in time, permanently. Not as future possibilities, as inscriptions, as reality. The strangeness of this picture is not, I think, the kind of strangeness that should worry you. It is the strangeness of recognizing that the universe was never set up to fit comfortably inside human intuition. The intuitions we have about time and self and continuity evolved on the African savanna over a few million years to help our ancestors find food and avoid predators and raise children. They were never tested against the structure of space-time or the behavior of electrons, or the question of what happens when a wave function is allowed to evolve without a special collapse rule. The fact that those intuitions break down when we apply them to the underlying structure of physics is not a sign that physics is wrong. It is a sign that we have always been working with a borrowed toolkit, designed for problems much smaller than the ones we are now using it to think about. Whether or not the block universe interpretation is right, the central question of this video, what does it mean for conscious experience under the many worlds interpretation, is not, in this combined picture, a question about the future. It is a question about a structure that, if both readings are right, already contains every possible version of you. Your conscious experience does not go on. It is already there. The branches you have not seen are not waiting to happen. They are already there. The version of you who is 120 in some catastrophic survival branch is already there. The version of you who did not survive the close call last year is already there. The version of you who took a different choice this morning is already there. This is not a picture that asks for action. It is a picture that asks for sitting with, which is what we have been doing all video, slowly, and which leaves us with one final question. What do you do with all of this? What does it mean for the version of you sitting here, listening, breathing, alive, in this branch, right now, on the inside view that you cannot leave? Is less than break time equals 1s, is greater than number, part 11, the last branch. Let me pull the threads together. We started with a thought experiment. A small room, a chair, a device wired to a quantum particle, a volunteer who survives 100 cycles, and, under the many worlds interpretation, finds themselves alive every time, because the version who didn't find themselves alive has no first-person point of view from which to file a report. We followed that thought experiment back to its source, to a graduate student named Hugh Everett at Princeton in 1957, who wrote down the many worlds interpretation as a way to take the Schrödinger equation literally and walked out of academia when the establishment told him it was nonsense. We followed his life to its end, and we followed the lives of his children, and we sat for a moment with the fact that his daughter, who passed away in 1996, left a note saying she was going to find him in a parallel universe. We then looked at why the math will not go away. The Schrödinger equation has been the working equation of quantum mechanics for a century. Decoherence, which was once used as an argument against the many worlds interpretation, has, the more it has been understood, become an argument for it. About 1 in 5 working physicists today endorses the many worlds interpretation, up from near zero in 1970. Sean Carroll, in his July 2025 Mindscape episode, made the case as clearly as anyone has, that human beings are physical systems made of the same matter as everything else, governed by the same equations as everything else, and there is no special exemption for brains. If the equation applies to a particle, it applies to the observer who measures the particle. The observer branches along with the particle. The math is one of the most experimentally verified pieces of mathematics in the history of science, accurate to about 1 part in 10 to the 11th in the most precise tests we have. We looked at how many branches your brain spawns per second. Approximately 10 to the power of 10 to the 17, a number whose digit count alone exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. We looked at what that means for every near miss in your life, and at the recognition that the version of you sitting here right now is, on this reading, the survivor's report from one filament of a structure too large to picture. We looked at Max Tegmark's walkback. He no longer expects to be subjectively immortal, but his reasoning, when you examine it, does not dissolve the question. It just shifts the disturbing implication from you live forever to you slide into thinner and thinner branches with every brush with death, your share of the multiverse decreasing forever, but never reaching zero. That is not, when you sit with it, a comforting answer either. It is a different version of the same one. We looked at Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff and the orchestrated, objective reduction hypothesis. The idea that consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon, that it lives in the microtubules inside your neurons, and that each moment of conscious experience is a quantum collapse event happening roughly 40 times a second. A 2025 review paper in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience argued that the theory deserves serious attention. If Auchor is right, the question of whether your conscious experience can end becomes a question about whether a quantum event can produce zero outcomes, and the answer, under the many worlds interpretation, is no. We looked at the corridor of catastrophic survival. The 2025 philosophy paper that argued the disturbing part of quantum immortality is not eternal life. It is what eternal life looks like, statistically, when most surviving branches are branches in which something terrible happened and you did not die from it. We sat with the recognition that doctors and nurses already grapple with the corridor in single-universe medicine, in actual hospital rooms, with patients in actual locked-in syndromes and persistent vegetative states. The many worlds interpretation If it is right, just makes the corridor the statistically expected destination. We looked at the old age problem. Why are the cemeteries not empty? 3 candidate answers. Consciousness fades gradually before the corridor gets visible. The measure of immortal branches is small enough that the typical observer does not find themselves there. Or the immortals are real, but spread across so many branches that, on this side, we do not meet them. Each answer has different implications for the strict immortality argument. None of the 3 dissolves it cleanly. We looked at Boltzmann brains, the Mandela effect, and Wigner's friend. 3 angles on the same uncomfortable point. The picture you have of being one continuous you in one continuous branch with continuous memory is doing a lot of work that the physics does not necessarily support. You might be experiencing immortality. You might be experiencing a thermodynamic flash with manufactured memories. You might be sliding between nearly identical branches without realizing it. From the inside, you cannot tell. And we looked at the block universe. The natural reading of relativity, which says past, present, and future, are all equally real, and that the flow of time is a feature of how we experience the structure, not a feature of the structure itself. Combined with the many worlds interpretation, this gives you a 4-dimensional branching crystal in which every possible version of you is permanently inscribed, in every branch, at every point in time, all at once. The most extravagant ontology in the history of science, according to David Deutsch, and the most direct reading of the math we have. None of this is settled. None of it has been proven. The many worlds interpretation is one reading of quantum mechanics, not the only one. Ochoa is contested. The block universe is debated. Every single step in the chain that gets us to the claim that your conscious experience cannot end can be reasonably disputed by a serious, working physicist or philosopher. The claim is not orthodoxy. The claim is one possibility among several that the math allows. I want you to know that before we close. But every step in the chain is also defended by serious people, in serious journals, with serious arguments. And the combination, even granting honest uncertainty at each step, is something that does not dissolve when you look at it closely. The math, in its most direct reading, keeps producing the answer. The physicists, in their most direct readings, keep finding themselves having to argue against the implications. The philosophers, in their most careful analyses, keep finding new versions of the same uncomfortable problem. This is not a fringe idea that science can dismiss. This is a possibility that lives inside our best current theories, and that has been getting harder to dismiss as the theories have been getting more carefully understood. So, what does it mean, on the inside, for the version of you who is sitting here right now? Not, I think, that you should be afraid of dying. The argument suggests the opposite. If anything, the disturbing question is what your continued conscious experience is doing right now, in branches you cannot see, whether some of those branches are the corridor, whether you, on this side, have been having a normal life or a survivor's life, and whether you would be able to tell the difference if you were. There is, possibly, a kind of cold comfort here, not the comfort of religious immortality, not the comfort of being told that you will be all right, something stranger and more honest, the thought that everything you have ever almost lost, you still have, in some branch, that everyone you have ever lost is still alive, in some branch, that every version of your life that was almost possible is, somewhere, the version that happened, that the version of you who took a different turn at the intersection 10 years ago is, somewhere, the person who has been living the life that turn led to, that the conversation you almost had, the call you almost made, the choice you almost stayed with, all of them are, somewhere, the conversation and the call and the choice that did happen, and every version that should not have happened also did. The corridor runs in both directions. There are branches in which the lump was malignant. There are branches in which the seatbelt was not on. There are branches in which the medication ran out and could not be refilled. Under the many worlds interpretation, all of these are equally real. The fact that your branch is the one where things went better, where you are still here to ask the question, does not mean the other branches are fictional. It just means you are not in them. I do not think it is my place on this channel to tell you what to do with any of this. I do not know what to do with it either. The physicists do not know. The philosophers do not know. The math just keeps producing the answer, and human beings keep trying to find a way to live with the answer, and the trying is, in some sense, the only honest response anyone has come up with. What I can do is say this. The universe, under our current best physics, is far stranger than the picture you grew up with. It is more populous, in the sense that it may contain more versions of you than there are atoms in this sky. It is more permanent, in the sense that, under the block universe reading, none of the past has gone anywhere, and none of the future is waiting to arrive. It is more entangled, in the sense that the boundary between me and everything else is, at the level of quantum information, much thinner than it feels. None of this is conjecture. All of it is in our best theories. All of it is being argued about, today, in 2026, by working physicists at universities you have heard of, in papers you can read. The thought I want to leave you with is small. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is the only one small enough to actually hold. Maybe the universe is a single thing, and you live in it once, and your conscious experience ends when your brain stops, and that is what death is. Maybe death is the gentle closing of a single door behind a single person who walked through a single life. That is one possible picture. It is the picture most of us grew up with. It is the picture the Copenhagen interpretation, if it is right, supports. Or maybe the universe is many things, and your conscious experience is permanently inscribed in a structure that does not end, and the version of you who is listening to these words is one of an unimaginable number of versions, each of whom thinks they are the only one. Maybe death, in this picture, is not the closing of a door, but the silent multiplication of corridors. Maybe the disturbing question is not whether your conscious experience can end, but what it is doing right now, in branches you cannot see, in versions of you you will never meet, and whether, somewhere along that corridor, one of them is the version who never gets to stop. I do not know which of these pictures is the right one. The physicists do not know. The honest answer is that, as of 2026, the question is open, and the open version of the question is more interesting than any closed version of it could be. What I do know is this. The version of you who is here, on this branch, in this room, breathing in and out, alive, is one version among an unknown number. That fact does not make this version less real. If anything, it makes this version more precious, because this is the only version you have access to. The other branches are silent. The other versions of you are not in contact. Whatever you are doing with this life, on this side of the branch, is the only thing you, this particular you, will ever do. That seems, somehow, like a thought worth sitting with for a moment, before you sleep. Before the next branching, which is probably already happening, in the inside of your skull 40 times every second. Good night, from the version of me on this branch. Wherever the other versions are, I hope they are all right too.